shocking exit on this week's episode of the Fantasy Ruckers Show. We catch up on all the news and notes that we missed out on over the Thanksgiving holiday, including the loss of a OG MLR team. The Fantasy Ruckers Show starts right now.
Where rugby and the world of fantasy sports collide. Welcome to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, talking all things rugby from the MLR to leagues around the world. We're on top of it. Headphones on, pads off. This is the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Now, here are your hosts, Ryan Yee, Matt Yee, and Devin Vanderpool.
What's up, everybody? This is episode 88 of the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Thank you so much to our Fantasy Ruckers League members, our community members, and everyone else tagging along on this journey of trying to make fantasy rugby a reality in the MLR. With you, as always, every single week, Matt Yee, Ryan Yee, here to break down all the latest in the fantasy MLR world. And we took a little break there for the Thanksgiving holiday, so I hope all of our listeners and viewers, our American listeners and viewers, had a good Thanksgiving holiday spent with family, friends, and like we said are on that episode a couple weeks ago. So thankful for all of our viewers and listeners for supporting us and continuing to help our journey of trying to make fantasy MLR a reality, because it's been a blast so far, about 2 years into this thing, and we hope we can continue the trend going here. But Maddie, how was your Thanksgiving holiday, man?
Ryan, you don't have to ask me. We were there together for it. The people know that we were there together for it, Ryan, but you know what? It was good. Lots of great food, lots of good time with family. Obviously got to see you. So yeah, no complaints. Lots of ham down the gullet. No turkey. That might be a debate, but we picked ham over turkey this year.
Yeah, a nice little family trip to the neck of the deep, darkest depths of South Central PA. Yeah, definitely had a great time there. And again, hope all of our listeners and viewers had a good Thanksgiving holiday as well.
You know what, Ryan? The MLR seems to have a knack for finding out when we're not doing shows.
Yeah, no kidding.
Because it just seems that they find a way to decide to have the loudest weeks on the weeks that we are off. So we got a lot to catch up on.
Yeah, I was just going to say that there's a whole bunch of news and notes, signings, trades, and a shocking exit that I said in our teaser of this show that we have to break down. But yeah, just like you said it, Maddie, it seems like the biggest breaking news happens on those weeks that we're off. So yeah, no time to waste here to break down all of the crazy stuff that's been going on over the past couple weeks. But before we get into it, guys, if you aren't already, make sure you're following us at the Fantasy Ruckers. The handles are up above on the YouTube video. If you're listening on the podcast, down below in the description at the Fantasy Ruckers. You'll want to be following all of those as we continue to try to make this a reality for everybody. Again, we mentioned it in every single episode. We're continuing to work that hopefully in the 2024 season that Fantasy MLR is open to everyone. So those social pages will be the first place you'll want to be to hear when that does happen. Check our website, thefantasyruckers.com. And if that's all not enough for you, join our Discord community. A lot of fun over there. A lot of great lads over there that are just as passionate about Fantasy MLR as we are. So why don't we get right into it, Matt? Because again, there's no time to waste here with all that has broken down here over the past couple weeks. I guess we got to address the elephant in the room.
Starting with the sad news, eh?
The theme for the Toronto Arrows has been the re-signing of their players and bringing back some of these guys. And there was a little bit of excitement building around the team with some of the signings and trades, bringing in Robbie Povey, Rangatira Waitokia, Ruida Biddle, some of the new faces that were going to come in on along with some of the key returnees of this Arrows squad. But the Toronto Arrows announced that they will not be participating in the 2024 season. This announcement being made about a week ago. And it was interesting how the news kind of broke, because there was some inklings and some kind of rumors being spread around that this was going to be the case. No official statement from the club had come out. There was, I believe, a Instagram post by Pints and Scrums, if I want to say Scrums and Pints, on Instagram that came through, which was kind of interesting. Matt, I know you have some connections with some of the boys on the Toronto Arrows squad, that you were hearing some rumblings, and then not too long after, the Arrows make an official statement, and I'll read it for our listeners here. because it was shocking news, to say the least. So the Arrows come out and say, it is with heavy hearts we formally announce that the Arrows will not participate in the 2024 MLR season. Despite extensive efforts carrying on following the passing of Bill Webb was simply too great a challenge for the club to overcome. We are working with the league office and contracted players regarding next steps, and in the spirit of the club's co-founder, we are also working with partners regarding the Arrows Academy and the continued development of Canadian rugby talent. To our fans, friends, partners, and the broader rugby community, thank you for your support over the years. As it relates to ticket refunds and other such matters, we will be providing further updates and details in the coming days and weeks. Yeah, and this was, again, tough news to kind of come out. And the big thing here, and I think that we're all on the same page here, Maddie, and I'll let you get your reaction on kind of this now, is that it's not a coincidence that this kind of coincides in the same year where there was the passing of Bill Webb, who was so passionate about Canadian rugby, about Arrows rugby. He was the face and the heart and soul of that team, and he just obviously put so much into this club. And it was just difficult, too big of a challenge to overcome for this Arrows squad to find someone with that same passion who is willing to invest just as much as Bill Webb was into this Arrows rugby club.
Yeah, I think that was definitely a catalyst for it all because he was, I like you said, one of the strong supporters in not just developing the Toronto Arrows, but also developing Canadian rugby as a whole. But yeah, it's tough news. I mean, it was surprising that sequence of events that day. It was seeing the inklings of the Instagram post. It was seeing the article by the province. And then once we saw the article, the province, you started felt like there was more credibility around it. I reached out to a couple guys on the squad, just to check in how they were doing. And, kind of got some confirmation of what the rumors were and that they were true. And then not too long after, the Arrows came out with the statement. Yeah, it's tough. I mean, the Arrows, to me, what this meant to me, and I'm wearing the Ontario Blues retro logo just to in honor of them. But to me, it's sad to see that Canada is no longer part of this competition. I think we're seeing the way that the US is able to kind of use the MLR, and they've been using it positively, to be able to develop their national squad. And we haven't seen the same benefits yet for Canada, but I think we were heading in the right direction. And I think also the other thing is that we are looking forward to a strong Arrows team this year. And we're kind of looking forward to a lot of, like you said, new additions. So it's just tough and it's last minute. It's, we're only 3 or 4 months out season. Guys are making provisions in terms of getting ready for the season, making sure that they're available to start in training camp and stuff like that. So it's crazy. I mean, if you want to hear more, I'm going to shout out the La Rouge Rugby podcast. I know that they had Captain Canada Lucas Rumble, the first Arrow, on their show. I would definitely go check that out to get more from the players, or from a player's point of view. But it's just sad. It's really sad to see them out of the league now. What I will say though, just from like a skeptical or from an outside looking in, it seemed like for me, this is troubling. Like this is pretty troubling for Canadian rugby as a whole. They weren't able to essentially, what it seemed like is they weren't able to pay the entry fee for this season, and they didn't have any investor to be able to do that. But the fact that they weren't able to find anybody across the whole country that's willing to support the club, I mean, that's troubling to hear for Canadian rugby, and that's troubling to hear for the future of Canadian rugby. And I'm not quite sure how Canadians and the Canadian rugby, world should take this, because I think this is not just losing an MLR team. This is such a bigger symbol for Canadian rugby as a whole.
No, that's a great point. I mean, there's a lot of things to break down there. I mean, the big thing again, I think this is a reflection, like you said, Maddie, of kind of where the climate and the environment of rugby kind of stands when it comes to Canadian sports and kind of the development that's happening there. Definitely a step back. Again, just so much excitement around this club, the new rebranding, again, we mentioned the players that were incoming. It was looking bright. I think there was a lot of kind of optimism heading after what was a tough 2023 campaign. There was a lot of optimism with this team heading into the 24 season. It just kind of all put to rest here with this announcement and the inability to find that investor that was as passionate. Again, I'll say this, that it's hard to find people like Bill Webb. and as
Yeah.
passionate it's not easy to own an MLR club, any MLR club in this day and age right now. Obviously, it's a long-term investment. Uh, Owners are not profiting from these teams right now. It's something where it's really just like kind of a side project that they can kind of put their money and hope that it continues to grow. And you need people that are kind of willing to bite that bullet and kind of take on those financial hardships
Yep.
and burdens there as it continues to grow. Because again, it's not like these teams are making any money. And that's what Bill Webb was. He was so passionate about this sport, so passionate about Canadian rugby as a whole, and passionate about the Arrows Club. He was again the heart and soul of this team and was willing to do that. It's surprising, but at the same time not surprising that there wasn't anyone really as in that same kind of mindset as Bill Webb, even though it's a very tall task to ask to kind of step in
Well,
those shoes.
right. I think it was surprising by the fact that they were making resign. They were. It wasn't like they were inactive. You know,
Sure. No,
after it
that's
all,
true.
they were still active, as if everything was going the same. Everything was happening as it should.
Right.
They were making trades. They were making re-signings. They were signing new players. Um, so it's
It came out of the blue.
Yeah,
It,
for
like
sure.
it wasn't like there was any indicators, that something like this was coming down the pipeline. It seemed like after there was the passing of Bill Webb that there was a lot of positive momentum, and they were obviously going to reflect on what Bill Webb provided for this team, but it sounded like they had some sort of pathway where they would be able to kind of move on
Yeah.
from Bill Webb and be able to move into this new era. But yeah, it just, again,
And
as soon as those rumors came out, it just kind of snowballed into this very,
yeah.
very quickly.
And you got to feel for the players. I mean, some of these guys were, getting ready, had provisions for living and provisions for housing and stuff like that, and fully prepared to have a job for the upcoming season. And now, in a harsh way to put it, they're technically unemployed
Yeah.
in some sense. So it's sad for the players. Kind of putting a spin on this in terms of MLR fantasy wise, Rye. I mean,
There's a lot of guys that they're not going to be
they,
we're losing a whole bunch of fantasy,
I mean,
really
but
good
yeah,
fantasy relevant
but
players.
like, where do these guys go? So
Mhm.
I think it'll be interesting to see where these guys go. I mean, we'll get into it, but like some teams have their roster
Right.
already planned out,
Right.
and guys, there's a salary cap that teams have to be mindful of, unless you're owned by Adam Gilchrist. But like, there's a salary cap that you need to be mindful of. And teams are reaching that limit. I mean, you're seeing some of these big signings coming in.
Mhm.
We know that some of the biggest signings in history in the past seasons have come in kind of this December time. But those big signings are international guys, right?
Yeah.
Like those big signings are big names. And we'll get to one that we're going to talk about later in the show. But like, where do these guys fit in MLR rosters these days? Do we look at, like, is LA a team that they're going to look at? Is Miami now? Do they have to fill out some rosters with some domestic players? Does Canada count as a domestic player now? Is that so? I would love to understand those dynamics. Fantasy wise, I mean, there's some quality players here. We look at like Rumble, Povey, Tarangatira Waitokia. We look at Rowita Biddle,
Mhm.
Sam Malcolm, all of these guys that we were talking about 2 weeks ago of, hey, we want to have these guys on our roster. We were even talking about how the back line is looking a little bit scary, are now just irrelevant. So
Yeah.
it's fantasy wise, I think we've definitely lost a depth of players. Luckily, we're kind of gaining the LA team, so it's going to be the same as the past season. But yeah, I mean, it'll be definitely interesting to see in the next coming months of where these players go, if they go anywhere, and what
Yeah.
happens to them.
Well, that's what I was going to say, is that, again, you mentioned how we're kind of getting even inching closer and closer to the start of the 2024 campaign. There's not much time. Again, we're
Yeah.
going to get into it about rosters being solidified, rosters being announced. The time is not is of the essence for some of these guys, because they got to find a new home. And there are guys that should be on MLR rosters: Lucas Rumble, Robbie Povey, Sam Malcolm. These are Rowita Biddle, Tarangatira Waitoki. These are all guys that should be on MLR rosters, and we'll see whether or not some teams can take advantage. Because, hey, the positive light of it is that if some of these teams that are still looking to fill out roster spots are looking at some of these guys, there are some very talented guys that they
Mm-hmm.
can take advantage of here and bring onto the squad. So yeah,
100%.
as a fantasy manager, you'll definitely want to keep an eye out of that and see maybe where some of these guys go. It's gonna I if I had to predict, it's gonna take some time here for any of that to
Yeah.
happen.
I'm sure they have lots of
Discussions need to
logistics
talk.
to sort out with the
Exactly.
Arrows organization and with the MLR, right? So,
Sure. And just like a couple things that I want to kind of mention on top of that. There is obviously that we've talked about this before. United States Rugby Players Association. They've kind of become a bigger and bigger body representing some of the players in the MLR. As we move forward, they came
yeah.
out with a kind of a statement slash thing here where the MLR plans to address the Arrows players on December 6th, and try to get some of more answers in terms of how they're coping with this whole folding of the Arrows. They listed out some questions that they need the answers to. So we'll see whether or not some of these Arrows
Yeah.
guys are able to get that. And then again, I think just talking about the state of rugby as a whole, an interesting tweet came out by Tier 2 Rugby at T2 Rugby. Pro rugby clubs that have folded in the last 18 months in England. You got Worcester, the Wasps, London Irish, all folding. Of course, we've had the LA Giltinis, the Austin Gilgronis, who have folded because of the whole fiasco with Adam Gilchrist. And now you got the Toronto Arrows in there too. So not the most optimistic stuff, seeing some of these pro rugby sides folding. Again, does it, I think before we kind of move on to kind of more other team news, Matt, and roster moves and maybe more positive stuff here, is that it's hard to not be concerned about the fragility of the MLR right now. It really does feel like if we lose owners who are passionate about this sport and passionate about their teams, that it doesn't take much for an entire franchise to get put
Yeah.
underground. And I think we've seen some resilience here. I think that was kind of with the whole, LA Giltinis and Austin Gilgroni situation. The MLR was able to power through that. We've added teams, with the Chicago Hounds and the Miami Sharks now. I think maybe it is like what you're saying, Matt, a whole Canadian versus USA type thing. It does seem like there are a lot of US investors that are kind of buying into some of these squads. We'll see.
Well,
To kind of leave it on like a cliff's edge here, it might be reading between the lines, and maybe it's reading a little bit too much into it, but it's not like the Arrows came out and said we're done forever. They did say that they're not participating in the 2024 season. Maybe that's going to buy them time to kind of figure
yeah.
things out, maybe find a new investor to hopefully rejoin the league in the future at some point. It's hard to be optimistic about that. There's a possibility. I'm not too sure, but again, it does provide some concern, but at the same time, to kind of temper kind of those concerns, is that the MLR has powered through things like this before. The league is growing. Players are coming. You'll see that with some of the signings and trades that we're going to be going through in this episode, that I think the league is still strong. It's going to hurt a lot because the Arrows were one of the OG teams that were part of this league, and to see them go is, like you said, Matt, sad. But yeah, it's an interesting
Yeah.
one.
Yeah. I mean, I have no doubt that the Arrows will probably still function as a club. They'll still function as some sort of development side and a provincial side for Ontario. Um, yeah, and to your point, Ryan, I think they might continue to continue to find investor, but in the meantime, they won't be part of the MLR. I will say though, to your kind of idea that look, when you lose an owner, they're hard to come by, and sometimes that means that you're going to lose a team, and we've seen trends of this. I mean, look, the Gilgronis, Giltinis, right? They have the whole Gilchrist ownership issue. They lose that owner, the team folds. Rugby Atlanta gets bought out by new ownership. A few months later, a year later, they fold and turn into LA. Toronto Arrows lost their owner. A few months later, now they fold. It seems like, that once you move past these initial ownerships that are really kind of driving force behind the league, that you have some instability. So we'll see what happens in the future here. But to your point, Ryan, I think the MLR seems to be resilient. The MLR seems to continue to kind of push to grow. And we still have, a lot of teams that I think are doing well in the MLR, and I think are doing a really great job in terms of drawing in international talent, drawing in local fans, and drawing in the eyes of the rugby community in North America.
Yeah, just sucks to see again. You mentioned it, Matt. No Canadian team in the MLR, at least for the
Yep.
foreseeable future, which is a tough one. As native Canadians here,
Yep.
and with kind of a special connection with that whole Toronto and Ontario kind of Blues Arrows
Believe
type
it's
development
pronounced
side.
Toronto, but yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a tough one to see, but I guess we'll see how it kind of goes around. And from a silver lining, as we shift into more kind of positive news with some of these rosters and trades, I will say the league is now back down to 12. That Eastern Conference becomes now the same size as all the
I
other
guess the Eastern Conference
conferences.
is going to be the same as the way that the Western Conference operates, where they'll play
Right,
each other twice,
right,
I
right.
guess.
So I guess we'll see with that and how that changes the competition rules.
Yeah.
But all right, let's shift on over now to some positive roster moves here. And I will say the outpour of support for the Toronto Arrows was huge from both Americans and Canadians on social media and stuff. Having people come out and really, I feel for Le Rouge Rugby podcast who have those Canadian and Toronto Arrows roots. And other people like that have supported this squad for so
And
long.
Jam Delay.
And Jam Delay. Yeah, our hearts go out to you guys for this this loss of a great franchise. But we'll see where it kind of turns the corner of this. But again, no shortage of support on social media. But let's shift on over here to the New England Free Jacks for some roster moves here and kind of a complete opposite spin around. And something that Matt you tweeted out about how nice it is for a franchise in
my
the
goodness.
MLR to be announcing their full roster for the upcoming season. Talk about how useful this is for fantasy managers, how much clarity it gives us in terms of what we can expect moving forward here and really extrapolate that out to kind of a fantasy impact. But
Yep.
yeah, the New England Free Jacks releasing on the past weekend their full roster list for the 2024 year. Have a lot of familiar names, have some new names, have some kind of omissions there that is kind of telling, and they did make a separate announcement about a certain omission that we'll get into. But Matt, just your overall kind of reaction to the Free Jacks announcing their 2024 squad.
What a breath of fresh air, Ryan. What a breath of fresh air. I mean, look, just because you announce a full roster now does not mean that you can't add to it later, that, there can't be unforeseeable circumstances that means guys leave. The fact that New England Free Jacks were able to do this at this time, I mean, I don't think we had any clarity on any rosters at this time last year. The fact there is just like in my tweet, I kind of said, look, they're setting the example of how to promote their team, how to promote their players. And I'm going to take let's start off with not even fantasy. The fact that they're now putting, hey, this is our team. This is who you can start cheering for. This is what you can start getting excited to, right? Like you can start getting excited for the return of Jason Potros and Reese McDonald. You can get excited for the fact that Leroux Milan, despite having a pretty, rough injury, is still going to be part of the squad. You can get excited about all these players that are on this team. And kind of know who you're going to be rooting for in the upcoming season, not just for New England Free Jack fans, but also, new fans, for people that are getting introduced to New England Free Jacks, for people who aren't cheering for the New England Free Jacks, they can say, hey, start some conversation around what kind of side this New England Free Jacks team is going to be. So I love to see it. I hope the other teams are going to follow suit. I doubt it because New England Free Jacks have always been ahead of the game in terms of the way that they operate. But you hope. I think the next one's probably going to be Seattle Seawolves. They're usually pretty good at that and up there with New England Free Jacks. But getting to the players, fantasy-wise, I love this for fantasy-wise, right? Ryan, you said the fantasy managers now know. They have an expectation of, hey, I can draft these guys and not, most likely these guys are going to be on the roster. Couple things that I would love to point out, Ryan. I think we're going to get to this later. I don't think we heard any announcement necessarily about Jason Potros and Reese McDonald. It's great to see them on the list there.
Yep.
And I'll let you touch on the omission there in that fly half position. But yeah, those are the two that I kind of looked at and was like, it's really great to see those guys. Mitch Jacobson, we see is back. Vian Conradi, we see is back. I'm a big fan of this. This is getting me really excited. We can even see the center pairing is remaining untouched. So this is, I think they announced this as saying like they have one of the highest retention rates of players, and you can see it in their squad that they're like, hey, we have a winning recipe. No need to change. We'll add some talent. We'll add some additions, but we got our core guys locked in, and they're just telling the world.
Yeah, no, I mean, they're featuring. They announced in that tweet that this is the highest rate of returning players in the club's history. So just so much. I really all I can say is there's so much stability when it talks to professionalism. The New
Yeah.
England Free Jacks are kind of like the epitome of that. And to your point, Matt, I think MLR squads need to kind of follow suit in terms of how they kind of approach their branding and their kind of professionalism, for lack of better
Yeah.
terms, in terms of how they kind of approach this. This is really what you strive for, and it's really cool to see.
Yeah.
But yeah, player wise, you gotta love it. You gotta love. I mean, I'm super from a fantasy perspective. I'm super excited to see Andrew Quattrin as kind of that main hooker position there.
Yep.
Friend of the show. He should be very very juicy for fantasy managers heading into this
Mm-hmm.
2024 year. Matt, you mentioned the guys like Vian Conradi, Mitch Jacobson, Cam Davidovitz should be fun. John Poland is returning back. Jason Putros, Reese McDonald, those guys are there. Yeah, that center pairing Wayne Vanderbank and Ben Lesage. And then when LaRue Milan is able to return from that gruesome injury he suffered at the World Cup, that he'll be able to be back in there. So it should be interesting. Mitch Wilson, Paula Bellacana are back. Again, just a lot of clarity here for fantasy managers to be confident in New England Free Jacks players that they're going to be picking for the 2024 year. And some of that clarity includes, Matt, you kind of alluded to it, the omission there is that Bodine Waka is not on that list. It was announced that Bodine Waka has signed a contract with the Mazda, and this just screams Japanese sports franchise at its finest. But the Mazda Sky Actives of Hiroshima,
Yeah.
incredible.
Well, Hiroshima gives it away, Rye. You know, pretty Japan when you have Hiroshima in your name.
Is true. But they will be returning, or he will be not returning to the Free Jacks, and he'll be playing for the Sky
This is
Actives in the 2024 season. But very similar to what he did in the 2023 year, where he signed with the Japanese team, played for them, and then he did return. I believe, if I pull it up, I believe the final couple weeks
yeah.
of the season. And then he was obviously available there for the playoffs as well. But Bodine Walker at least
He,
won't be there for a majority of the year.
I mean, I think like he wasn't that fantasy relevant even when he did return. I think he might have had one big game, but other than that, he wasn't really that fantasy relevant. It's just interesting to me. I didn't expect this. I kind of assumed that once he signed a long-term 20 like contract through 2025, that he would just be a New England Free Jack and be committed to that. But look, we love seeing guys getting their opportunity overseas. He obviously deserves to get that money in Japan when he needs to get it, and I think he feels comfortable, and it's classy by the New England Free Jacks to allow him to do that and kind of give him a home that he can always come back to. Fantasy wise, if I'm looking at Jason Potros's value and he's skyrocketing, right? Like
Yeah.
we're seeing him back. We saw the type of season he had last year. There's no reason to expect that he'll drop off. So that's a great thing to see for fantasy wise. Reese McDonald, I mean, they have him listed here as a fly half, but I can see him also having the same fantasy impact. This is also is great for him as he's going to be probably their starting fullback going into the year because we saw the type of impact that Reese McDonald had when he was at fullback. So I think those guys are going to benefit most from this, and I'm excited to see how they go on.
And I wouldn't even say Bodine Walk as a stash. Even again, you mentioned it.
Uh,
He played a little bit a while ago. Last season, he appeared back on the bench for the first time in round 13.
yeah.
Played in round 15, started, got 12 and a half fantasy points in that matchup, and then started in round 17 too. Did not appear in round 16. Yeah, again, it's just not work because he
It's
can't go in
not.
the IR spot.
And you don't know
He
if he's
can't.
going to return. You don't know.
Right.
We have no guarantees. I think last year it was the fact that he was actually not getting that much playing time was the reason that he came back. So,
Right.
so we don't know what's going to happen. Maybe he has a great year over there and he continues to play. And I don't think, to your point, Ryan, I don't think it makes sense to stash him. I think he'll just be when he comes back, he'll be a big waiver wire guy.
Yeah, it will be the case. I believe, if I recall correctly, he wasn't drafted last year in our fantasy league.
Well, we assumed
either.
he wasn't coming back. We
Sure.
didn't know.
And he ended up being one of the bigger waiver wire pickups. I forget how much fab was dropped on him, but
A lot.
it was a significant amount. And then
It wasn't
again,
worth
never really lived up to that expectation.
Yeah.
In there. And then before we move on, Mason Coach also being signed by the New England Free Jacks. Guy could be kind of fantasy relevant. Hooker, we'll see kind of where he slots in there. Again, we have Quatrin that is probably going to be that starting main guy there.
Yeah.
The coach finished off as the front row 52 last year, 30.7 fantasy points on there. So probably stream worthy if you see him starting in that New England Free Jacks lineup, but nothing crazy fantasy relevant there.
Yeah, and just a quick thing on the omissions here. I guess so. We didn't hear anything about Keanu Kiyori-Seams, who was one of the guys from the NBC Bunnies Cup that they signed last year. I guess he's not coming back. Even though the Mason Koch signing, I think this is really big for Quatrin. I think this shoots Quatrin's value straight up. I'm really excited to see how he does fantasy this year because I think he's going to finish in the top 5 of front rows.
Wow. All right. Well, let's shift on over to the Utah Warriors now. Utah Warriors have been pretty active this offseason. They've been pretty good with their announcements and everything. But I'm going to list it off here, and then, Matt, we can break down kind of who you think is the most fantasy relevant. They signed Logan Crowley, scrum half from the NPC Bunnies. He played 6 seasons there. New Zealander. Should be interesting where he kind of slots in
quick
for
tidbit.
the Utah Warriors. Yep.
Quick tidbit for him. Nephew of former Rugby Canada coach Kieran Crowley.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Did not know that. That's a fun fact there.
That's a little fun fact there, but I think this is nice for them. Obviously, with Connor McLeod leaving, I forget who they signed this year in the offseason, but I know that scrum half room. This is definitely a good addition, I think.
Yeah. So Logan Crowley will be definitely something that fantasy managers will want to take a watch out for to see whether or not he holds down that starting position. Could be pretty solid on a explosive Utah Warriors offense. They re-signed Franco Vandenberg, front rower. He had 33.9 fantasy points last season. Kind of another one of those streaming guys. Front row 47, 259th overall. Not too fantasy relevant there. But a bigger one, Tuvera Vugakoto re-signing with the Utah Warriors as well. The front row 23 in fantasy circles, 182nd overall, finished with 52.8 fantasy points. Tuvera was an interesting player. He was a guy that kind of was able to slot in that front row position, had scored 1 try on the season, but he was able to kind of get those meters gained roughly around here. He had that kind of like get you 5 points if you needed it. Kind of that one of those higher end streaming guys that you could lean on if he was, starting in a match. If he wasn't, kind of you left him out on the waiver wire. But if you're starting, a guy that you could kind of slot in there was able to get you some meters, gain some tackles.
This is kind of interesting. They signed Nick Suchon earlier in the year. They bring Vugakoto in. Obviously, they lost Henry Bell. And I believe they brought in another front row as well, another hooker as well, a Phil Bradford in as well. So, 3 hookers. Obviously, this is something that we expect. But I mean, that's a talented room right there. Vugakoto showed that he could start for sure, and we know what we can expect from Nick Suchon. So, this is a pretty talented front row hooker room that they're putting together.
And then it's always good to see Utah signing some of their pathway guys. Back rower Khaleesi Moley is signing with the Utah Warriors. Went up through the ranks, local guy coming up into the senior squad through their development program. And then Zach Barker, front rower as well, signing from their pathway squad. So always cool to see kind of guys that are homegrown make it up through there. And Utah's always been good with that, I feel like. Utah has always had an emphasis on kind of growing those homegrown guys. All right, shifting on over to the Houston SaberCats. This one had several big signings, some key fantasy signings here over the past couple of weeks when it comes to the Houston SaberCats. 3 big-time players returning that are fantasy relevant. Jerry Labuschagne, back threer, South African, 78.2 fantasy points, finished off as the back 336, 121st overall. Christian Dyer also re-signing, your back 3 center hybrid, 141 fantasy points, finished off in the top 15 of back 3 players, finished off as the back 312, 28th overall in all of fantasy. And then Drew Wild, back 3 player as well, 104.8 fantasy points, finished off in the top 30, back 328 and 77th overall. So 3 guys there that had big time fantasy relevance that are all going to be wearing the SaberCats jersey once again for the 2024 year.
Yeah, we love to see that. Those are some players that are definitely fantasy relevant. Like you said, Christian Dyer, I mean, it's great to see him back. I don't think there's any doubt that he'd be back. I think there's probably a bit more doubt to see, okay, it's good to see Drew Wild back in the lineup, back with the Houston SaberCats, back in the MLR. It's also great. I'd love to see kind of, I don't think, from my memory, Jerry Labuschagne didn't get a full season last year with some injury. So really great to see him re-signing. And hopefully we get a full season out of him because we know how electric he can be.
Yeah, starting off with Christian Dyer again, 141.1 fantasy points. Started in all 15 matches that he played in the fantasy season. Scoring a whole 9 tries all year, 728 meters gained, a season high 19.4 fantasy points at that back three possession in round 10. 16.6 in round 2, 15.8 in round 17. So this guy had that. He was like one of those middle tier back three players or middle tier center players that you can kind of rely on. Definitely will be going in the earlier rounds, I think, in the 2024
Yeah.
draft, at least I would imagine in the top 4 rounds of our MLR draft. And then again, I think the optimism is there for Labuschagne. 78.2 fantasy points in the 8 matches that he started in, 11 that he played in total. Again, he had that explosibility. We saw that in 2022. And he scored a high 16.5 in round 3, 15.6 in round 6. So he has that ability. 2 tries on the season, 524 meters gained in that limited time. So interesting. And Drew Wild always has that try scoring potential that we've seen before. He 2 tries on the season and was consistent there for you with some of those meters gained as well. So
Yeah.
good to see that. And then another quick sign that I'll just go over, Val Lilo returning with the Houston SaberCats. That just recently announced. Not really fantasy relevant there, not even streaming worthy, I would say, but just something to keep on your radar there as a guy that will be in the Houston SaberCats front row room. All right, moving on to the Chicago Hounds. Again, a handful here of big time signings. I will start off with Patty Ryan re-signing with the Chicago Hounds. Not necessarily fantasy relevant. Finished off as front row 63, only 24.4 fantasy points. Just doesn't get the opportunity that you need for him to be fantasy relevant. But the big time one is Mark O'Keefe returning to the Chicago Hounds. Had 120 fantasy points last season. Finished off in the top 20 of centers, center 17, and in the top 50 of players overall, 47th overall. The return of Mark O'Keefe is a big one here, and a guy that was a pretty big staple of that center line there for the Hounds.
Yeah. Love to see it. Well, hoping that Chicago Hounds have a better year this year, which hopefully means that there'll be a better year for Mark O'Keefe as well. We saw him play a lot on the wing. So, we'll see how it goes and where he finds himself in that lineup. And yeah, I'm hoping for a pretty big year upcoming for him.
And I think for Mark O'Keefe, he had a disappointing, I think, fantasy year for many managers. In the 2023 year, I think there was a lot of optimism for him, especially with what he was doing for the Gilgronis before. He opens up the season with his season high scoring potential there for fantasy points at 21.4 fantasy points, racked up 150 meters gained, 10 tackles, and a breakdown still in that first game. And then he just kind of never lived back up to that standard. Again, he kind of shifted to that back three position. He had 18.9 points in round 7 at that back three position with a try, 130 meters gained, and 3 tackles. But just never got that point. 20 points in round 5 at the back three position. So the potential is there. Mark O'Keefe is an explosive player. He's just got to find that consistency. And I think that's what managers will be looking for in the 2024 year as to whether or not he can kind of establish himself as kind of a consistent fantasy performer that they thought he was going to be heading into the 2023 year.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, like I said, this will rely on how well the Chicago Hounds are this year, and how well they go. And hopefully they go better, which means Mark O'Keefe will do better.
Absolutely. All right. Mike Matarazzo returning with the Hounds as well. He was kind of your streaming. I mean, he was a pretty adequate second row guy. I mean, 51.2 fantasy points is not great, but finishing off as the second row 20, he was probably a guy that was not on people's benches, but he was definitely available on the waiver wire if you needed him to pick him up to kind of slot in your second row position. You really weren't looking at him as he has that second row, back row eligibility. You weren't really looking at him as your back row kind of replacement at any single point, but second row adequate. He had 4 5-point performances here and there, a 7.6 point performance in round 9. So definitely a guy you could kind of stream in your lineup if you're desperate for kind of a second row start. He's returning back with the Chicago Hounds as well. And then last thing, a international signing here for the Hounds, Giannis Venter from the Cheetahs Rugby and the Curry Cup is signing with the Hounds, hooker, and we'll see where he kind of slots in with that front row room.
Yep. And I know just one thing on Matarazzo. I mean, we've seen his history with Dallas before he went to Chicago. He has the opportunity to be a stud. So this is a good signing. Hopefully that he, like you said, definitely be on that kind of streaming platform for guys to be able to put him into lineup when they need a guy.
Absolutely. All right, shifting on to the Seattle
Oh, I'm excited,
Seawolves.
Ryan.
This one's a big one. Yeah, this one's a big one. Why don't we get into it first here? Wallabies and Brumbies legend Tavita, K-Train, Kuradrani,
Oof,
who has 2015, 2019
this is
World Cup
silly.
experience with the Wallabies, has been out of professional rugby for a little bit here. It's the last time he was playing for France Biarritz Olympique Pays Basque, I think is how you
Nice.
say it,
I don't think so, but
18 months
nice.
ago. So he's been a little bit out for a little bit, but man, K Train, it's gonna be
This
interesting to see kind of
is,
the impact he makes for the Seattle Seawolves.
I mean, I think it was Brian Ray that tweeted this out when this got announced. But I mean, we look at this at the center room now for Seattle, and I mean, you're looking at what Dan Creel, you're looking at Tavit Lopetti, you're looking at now Tavita Kurajani. Like those are three quality guys. I would be interested to understand, like you said, right? He's been out of rugby a little bit. I'd be interested to see, you know, what his role is. Is it going to be to the likes of Ma'ananu, where Ma'ananu's actually in that lineup pretty
Sure.
consistently? Or is it going to be like, hey, look, we've got these centers here. You're going to be have a role as like you'll come in sometimes and play, but you won't be expected to play full 80 or even 70. So I'd be interested to understand what it's like if he's in there playing full form, no restrictions. Oh boy, this guy, he should definitely be on guys's board. The only concern for me is going to be playing time. Like,
Yeah.
is he going to be playing all games? Probably not, maybe not. And then, just because the Seattle Seawolves would be so happy to just be like, hey, we're fine with playing Tavit Lopetti and Dan Krill. These guys are studs. These guys have gotten us to where we needed to go before. He's just a nice, juicy addition. So it'll be interesting to see what it's like.
It's going to be interesting to see where he kind of falls in this upcoming draft in
Yeah.
the 2024 season because, you want to take a flyer on him. He's definitely not going to go undrafted. But
Yeah.
again, I think there's just a huge question mark. I don't think this necessarily hurts any of Dan Creel's value. I think Dan Creel is still a staple of that Seattle lineup. Tavit Lopetti is where I kind of get a little bit more worried and concerned to see how much of K Train actually eats into that. So
This is
we'll
actually where I think, hey, look, like, can defeat Lopetti. Have we seen him? I'm trying to think back if we've seen him in the back three in the wing before. I feel like we haven't, but is that somewhere where he's willing to go to? Like, again, I personally don't see Kurajani as a guy who's going to play all year.
Sure.
I don't see him as a guy who's going to pump in 80-minute games anyways.
Right.
But to your point, Ryan, this does have an impact on Tavit Lopetti regardless.
Yeah.
So we'll see what happens there. In terms of the draft, I mean, I don't know. I'm sure we're going to see a guy pull trigger on him pretty high. I personally would not. I'd be kind of tempered with this. If I don't get him, I'm okay with it. I'm not crying over it. Just because there's so many questions, at least from me, of what his involvement is.
Right.
So it's kind of similar with Mananu. I mean, when he was announced as signed, there was some hesitation of like, hey, what's his involvement going to be this year? What's his involvement going to be with the team? How active is he going to be in the lineups? And I'll be interested to see, and I'm looking forward to seeing him kind of helping grow the MLR rugby.
Yeah, so Tavita, K Train, Kurajani, welcome to the Seattle Seawolves. Going to be excited to see you playing in the MLR, and we'll see how that kind of that plays
electric
out here. Yeah, it's gonna be a whole lot of fun. I will say, just to add in and to kind of wrap up this conversation, Tavit Lopetti played center, started in 8 of the 12 matches he played in all season long. So either there's going to be a shift there, or Tavita is going to be eating into some of that playing time there. So we'll see. Fantasy Manager is just something to keep an eye out for. Not really necessarily fantasy relevant, but always cool to see in the MLR. The Seawolves announced a partnership with the Japanese D2 side. The Urayasu D-Rocks in the Japanese League One Division 2. I'm just going to mention that. We don't need to keep too much time on this, but just cool to see these partnerships. They said that Carl Keane, scrum half for the Seawolves, has been playing over there.
Yeah, I think he's drafted like, what, 2 years ago or last year?
Yeah. So it's cool to see that they're getting opportunity in these overseas leagues during the off season. So it's cool.
All I'll say, Japan, you're known for your efficiency, but you're calling your league Japan League 1 D2. Just call it Japan League 2. It's okay. You can do that. There's no issues with that.
All right, and then Seattle involved in a trade with the San Diego Legion. They received Tyron Al-Jabouri, the 12th overall pick from this past year's 2023 MLR draft for 2024 salary cap considerations. Fun fact: he is the, I believe, brother, I want
Yep,
to say,
I believe so.
of Milan Al-Jabouri of the Houston SaberCats. So a little bit of movement there from the Seattle Seawolves side of things, and then just touching on the San Diego Legion, since they were the other part of that trade. They have announced the signing of Ethan Grayson, a U20 English player who has played in the Premiership with the Bedford Blues most recently. So just another international signing there. Anything you want to touch on there before we move on to Old
Uh,
Glory DC, Matt?
I would actually let's take a look at Ethan Grayson a little bit and kind of see that as a, you don't throw away your international slots for nothing.
Sure.
This guy's going to get playing time. I would be interested to see how he fits in that back line. Is that, yeah, I would be interested to see how he fits. I think he's actually going to be a sneaky guy. It's going to be fantasy relevant this year. So it's just a matter of, you know, when do they announce, kind of once we start seeing what the San Diego Legion backline looks like and what their roster looks like, we'll get a better sense of what his involvement will be.
Yeah, we know that from the center position, it was a whole lot of Marcel Brackey and obviously Ma Nanu that
Yeah.
slotted in that position. Maybe Ethan Grayson kind of fits into that area. And of course, with the back three, we know that they're pretty solidified there with
Yeah.
Augsburger, Awake, and Mikey Teo. So where Ethan Grayson kind of slots in there will be interesting. Maybe this is a sign that Ma Nanu is going to maybe slowly start to taper back some of his playing time as he gets older, and Ethan Grayson's kind of the next guy up. But we'll see whether or not that will be the case.
Yeah.
All right, shifting on over to Old Glory DC. A couple things here which have been pretty interesting. I got to start off with friend of the show, Cali Martinez, returning with the
Let's
Old Glory
go.
DC. Not really fantasy relevant last year, but this is a guy that I think could eventually be kind of fantasy relevant as one of those front row streamers. Doesn't have that hooker upside, but uh Old War DC, pretty solid squad. Cali Martinez was pretty kind of dynamic. He's athletic. He'll be a guy that there's possibility there that he can do something as he starts to solidify himself in this lineup. Only started one match last year, I believe, inside the fantasy season. So if he can start getting more playing time, we'll see whether or not he can be a guy that kind of steps up here into fantasy circles.
Yeah. All I gotta say is let's go, Cali. Keep at it, bud.
And then a couple other signings and re-signings. They re-signed John Rizzo, 30.7 fantasy
Love
points
to
at
see
that
it.
back three position. Has potential there. Rizzo just never
Oh.
kind of solidified himself into the starting lineup. But when he did, he had some explosive games of 18.3 fantasy point performance in round 15. So we'll see whether or not, if he kind of inserts himself more with his Old Glory DC side, whether or not he can become more fantasy relevant. They signed Joe Rafter, a front row player from the English Championship with Hartpury RFC. So another interesting signing there to kind of bolster that front row room. And then the kind of the big news that I want to kind of touch on here, Kurt Baker, which is optimistic. I mean, it's sad to see kind of him, kind of, I guess, is a sign of him hanging up the boots here.
Yeah.
But he is returning as the attacks coach for the Old Glory DC squad. Obviously, he was kind of that player coach role last year, had faced that concussion kind of partway through the season. Still fantasy relevant, 52.9 fantasy points, kind of was a streaming guy that was kind of picked up here and out throughout the year just with that name there. But it looks like he's going to be stepping back in more of a coaching role this upcoming
Yeah.
season.
And I mean, look, he still had it. I think the concussion probably definitely has a play in this one. For me, what I take out of this is I'm really happy to see the fact that he could easily just go back to New Zealand and
Yeah.
go back home and kind of enjoy retirement like that. Um, but the fact that he's willing to kind of be here, stay here, be involved with Old Glory DC, be involved with the MLR as a legend himself, that's great to see. And I hope that Old Glory DC is kind of going to reap the benefits of his involvement as a full-on coach now, rather than having to balance being a player coach.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, shifting over to the NOLA Gold now. A big re-signing of Pat O'Toole, and this was one of those favorite ones, Matt, of yours, that they're a little bit more clarity here. They're signing him through the 2025
Oh,
year.
I love that.
Definitely a fantasy relevant guy, definitely on rosters,
Mhm.
even more so than a streamer. 67.4 fantasy points, finished off as the front row 15, and 147th overall. Pat O'Toole, I think, was one of those guys that was kind of a guy that kind of was hurt fantasy value wise because of kind of the stagnant Nola Gold kind of
Yeah.
performances that we started to see. But when he was there and he was able to kind of capitalize, he did solid. I mean, 15.2 fantasy points in round 15, 78 meters gained, a try and 8 tackles, a try in round 9, a try in round 10 as well. Pat O'Toole is definitely going to be one of those later guys after that kind of first wave of impactful hookers kind of goes across in our MLR league. I think he's a guy that's going to be that next step up where he's kind of relevant here. He gets you points. He's not going to be a leading guy in that front row room or that front row circle for fantasy, but he's going to be at least adequate enough for you to start him
Yeah.
confidently on most weeks.
Well, so last year he was fighting a lot with Eric Howard for the starting role. Correct me if I'm wrong, and we'll have to fact check myself, but I believe Eric Howard has announced his retirement earlier in the year, or a while back. So I mean, hey, this is pretty big for Pat O'Toole. The fact that he's able to now kind of have that solidified role, and be that starting hooker and not have to battle for that starting role. I think it will be interesting, and I think his fantasy value will definitely go up this year. So yeah, I'm looking forward to see what he does for that Nola Gold, and I think Nola Gold's obviously going to be a little bit better than they were last year.
Yeah. All right. Shifting over to now the Dallas Jaguars. I do believe I can confirm that I think Eric Howard did announce his retirement. He was also
Yeah,
selected in that Miami like 25 selection, I think, in there as
yeah.
well. So,
So
yeah, a little
yeah,
bit
Pat
of
O'Toole. I think
concern
this
there.
is going to be right. I know you said that like he did have performances. I think we're going to see a better Pat O'Toole this year. I think Pat O'Toole will definitely be on fantasy rosters, and definitely be a guy who's going to crack that top 10 of hookers in the league.
All right, shifting on over now to the Dallas Jackals. We'll start off with probably the one that excites people the most in fantasy circles, but the return of Thomas Kubia, who
Hmm.
joined Dallas kind of towards the later end of that season there, and made starts and appearances in round 16 and 17 in our fantasy season, and was adequate. I mean, 9.9 fantasy points in round 16 and 8.4 in round 17. He'll now have a full off season under his belt, be able to kind of familiarize himself with the Dallas Jackals franchise, and we'll see whether or not I'm sure he'll be starting for the Dallas Jackals for the 2024 year, which should mean that Thomas Kubia will be a very fantasy relevant asset here for the upcoming season.
Yeah, love to see it. I mean, Thomas Kubia, when he signed on, he had some big games, and he had some consistent performances on a Dallas Jackals side where we just didn't expect that. So I love to see that. I'm looking forward to him getting a full season under his belt. I think he's going to be definitely a guy who's going to get drafted, and going to be a guy who's going to be coming off some teams' benches and be there, and held on fantasy rosters all year.
And then as we start to wrap up this news and notes segment, Dewald Coatsy is also returning to the Dallas Jackals for his third season. A
Good for
guy that was
him.
definitely fantasy relevant as well. I mean, front row 17, 158th overall,
Yeah.
61.2 fantasy points overall. Yeah, I mean, this was a guy that you were having on your bench, could slot in for you as your starting front rower as needed. And he'd be pretty solid for you again on a surprising performances when it came to kind of being on the Dallas Jackals, but 15.1 fantasy points in round 14 when he scored 2 tries. He ranged from about 1.8, never goose egged you, never got you anything too crazy. 5.1 fantasy points here and there. But yeah, Dewalt Coatsy returning with the Dallas Jackals.
Yeah. I mean, look, his performance will go up as Dallas Jackals' performance goes up, and hopefully we see a better Dallas Jackals team this year.
And then to wrap up the news and notes segment, the New York Ironworkers are announcing the retirement of second rower Nate Brakeley and team captain for New York. He is hanging up the boots, which is a sad one to see.
Yeah.
87.4 fantasy points, second row 10, finished off in that top 10 and 106 overall. Nate Brakeley was a guy that was definitely fantasy relevant. Guys were definitely, especially at that second row position, really eyeing him, and he was a regular starter for us in
Yeah.
seasons past.
And I think we saw this coming. He announced his retirement from international rugby, I think right after that Spain tournament that they
Right.
won. And then now it's confirmed kind of what his role is now, and that he's going to be, or what his standing was in the MLR, that he would be retiring. It'll be interested to see what kind of role he plays as he continue to kind of be part of that New York Ironworkers facility and that coaching staff. But I mean, look, congrats to you, Nate Brakely. You had a hell of a career. But New York Ironworkers, this was not the announcement we were looking for. You can't tease something a month back in the past saying, oh, admin, when we're looking at the signing list of what we need to announce, and then it's been a month later and you haven't said anything about signings, not even a re-sign. You're the only team that has yet to announce anything. You have announced absolutely nothing. And, we're talking about the New England Free Jacks being the pinnacle of the way that the team should operate in terms of announcing signings, in terms of announcing rosters, the transparency. You, my friends, have been absolutely closed off, haven't said anything. I've hardly seen a tweet from you outside of this one, frankly. And it's kind of been a joke. So I don't know, New York Ironworkers, I don't know if it's come with the name that you guys have gotten a little snobby, that you guys build bridges and stuff, but maybe just take a step back, look in the mirror and start realizing that you can't be teasing stuff and then never announce it. That's my rant. I've been waiting for us to get to the New York Ironworkers, for you to say this in our notes so that I could go off on this tangent and start yelling at them, because as you can see from our news and notes section, every other team in the MLR is making notice of who they're signing, who they're re-signing, what's happening with their team. And for the New York Ironworkers, I guess you guys think you're way too good for that. But hey, let's let all the other teams, sign Tavita Kurajani, and let's end up not making the playoffs again like a bunch of losers that you were last season. So figure it out, announce it. And yeah, let's maybe try to not have a season like last year. And maybe by announcing some players, you can help do that.
I did not think that that's the way that this show would end, would be on Matthew on his soapbox, giving the New York Ironworkers a little talking to. Damn.
It's getting ridiculous, Ryan. They can't. Who let the admin put that tweet out? Somebody let them do that. And what were they looking at, a blank piece of paper and just said, oh, we better stir the pot here. And then you think that I would forget? You think me?
Never forget.
No, but we have not forgotten New York Ironworkers admin. Figure it out.
What comes first, the New England Free Jacks jersey kit announcement or a signing from the New York Ironworkers?
I mean, so I'm going to go, let's be logical here. Let's bring the tempers down. I'll tone it back about 25%. But so when's the announcement for New England Free Jacks? Do you remember the date?
Early December.
Okay, early December. So from my memory,
which is right now.
Yes.
And honestly, it could be announced by the time that this show comes out.
Okay. They said I mean, they did announce their roster, so I'm expecting there to be some other announcements as well. So I think from my memory,
December 5th. So it will be coming out when this podcast released on the Tuesday.
Tay Walden was announced around late December.
Okay.
That's when I expect New York Ironworkers to announce it this year again.
Okay.
So they're going to get beat by the jersey announcement, and
your Christmas present to you.
The New England Free Jack jersey announcement is not going to be special. Yes, they'll have parallel bars. Yes, they'll probably have a collar. Yes, they'll just have a new logo that has the people looking facing back to back. But other than that, it'll be the same. Not a big deal. New York, I don't know. Maybe just, I don't know. Get your stuff together. Just put it in a ball, put it in a backpack, and get it together and do something. All right.
Well, we can take a deep breath now. Whole bunch of news and notes that we had to catch up on this after post Thanksgiving.
We keep going through these news and notes, and every time either they're not even there or we have to make up something about their team.
Yeah, we want to. This at some point. People can't be just leaving the Ironworkers. Can't have retirements. We got to have some people joining here, and maybe that's what we'll find out here in the next weeks to come. But
no, we won't.
Again, over the past couple weeks, no shortage of news that we had to catch up on. Again, also, super heartbreaking with the Toronto Arrow stuff. Yeah.
Well, I mean, sorry, I was on my soapbox. I'm kind of having a hard time coming down. And just another thing about silence. Maybe let's LA team MLR. Let's figure that one out here. One out here. New York Ironworkers, they don't have any, but at least they had a team last year. So we kind of know, Co's probably coming back. But LA,
we don't know.
We have no clue. Just help me, please. The people need to know.
Well, a whole bunch of stuff then to look forward to. We got a jersey reveal coming up this week from the New England Free Jacks. We're still waiting on a little bit more clarity from this LA squad that we still don't know the team name of. It's still comical that with the competition update that we got last week, that is just LA rugby team there on their thing. So we'll wait for that as well. hopefully there'll be some new New York Ironworkers announcements coming down the pipeline. And again, there's going to be a whole much more roster moves. We'll probably hear some more developments when it comes to this Toronto Arrows fiasco here. Again, heartbreaking for us to lose that squad. Hopefully we can see some light at the end of the tunnel and there'll be a turnaround here. But at this point, just really tough to see. And then hopefully we see some more roster announcements and teams follow suit with the New England Free Jacks, and we start seeing some finalized rosters for the 2024 year, which as fantasy managers definitely going to be a little bit helpful as we inch closer to the 2024 year and ultimately that 2024 draft where everyone should be able to partake in fantasy MLR, which is still coming down the line. Again, follow us at Fantasy Ruckers and you'll find out. Anything else you'd like to add, Matt, for this episode number 88?
No, I think I've said enough.
I think you have said enough. I think you need to take a deep breath, go do some meditation, and maybe get the New York Ironworkers off your mind. All right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, hey, for Matt Yee, for myself, for Devin Vandy Vanderpool, we are the Fantasy Ruckers, and we'll be back next week with more fantasy MLR content.
We love you, Arrows.
You've been listening to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, covering everything rugby from the MLR and beyond. We hope you enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review, and be sure to tell all your friends. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, connect with us on social media at the Fantasy Ruckers. Till next time, this is the Fantasy Ruckers Show, signing off.